As a writer and geographer, I've traveled all over the world, visiting remote locations, documenting unique landscapes, and diving into the unknown. But nothing prepared me for the horrors I would face in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I first heard about the Smokies from fellow travelers, stories of strange occurrences, disappearing hikers, and eerie sounds that echoed through the foggy mornings. They dismissed it as superstition, but my curiosity got the best of me. I had to see it for myself. What's the worst that could happen in a national park, after all? I would quickly learn that there are worse things than being lost in the woods. I arrived alone, like I always do. There was something soothing about the isolation, the crisp mountain air mixing with the scent of pine and damp earth. The park stretched before me, its vastness both daunting and inviting. I had already prepared a detailed itinerary, maps, research, and notes filled with topographical sketches of the land. But none of that mattered. The moment I set foot in the Smokies, the land seemed to have a life of its own, as though it had been waiting for me. And in some twisted way, I had been drawn there, whether I liked it or not. The first night, I camped near an old trail I found on a map. It was tucked away from the usual tourist spots, a perfect location for solitude. The wind was quiet, and the moon barely peeked through the thick canopy of trees. That's when I started to hear it, the rustling sounds in the distance, almost too rhythmic to be made by animals. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or wind, no. This was deliberate, too controlled, and it wasn't just one sound. It felt as though the forest itself was moving. I tried to dismiss it as the wind, or perhaps the wind playing tricks on me, but then there was the whispering. Low, distant voices carried through the air, so faint that I couldn't make out the words, yet loud enough to stir something deep in my chest. The hairs on my neck stood up. A chill crawled down my spine as I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint the source. But the more I listened, the more disoriented I became. The following morning, the forest was thick with fog, cloaking the landscape in an eerie, suffocating silence. I packed up my gear, eager to move on from the unsettling night. But as I walked deeper into the forest, something felt wrong. The trees towered above me, their shadows growing longer, and I began to realize that I had lost my sense of direction. I had studied these maps for months, yet now the landscape seemed unfamiliar, constantly shifting as though it didn't want me to leave. Panic began to set in. The map in my hand seemed useless as I retraced my steps, only to find myself deeper in the woods. The faint whispering from last night returned, louder now. I tried calling out to no one in particular, but my voice was swallowed by the vast expanse. I kept walking, stumbling over roots and rocks, my heart racing in my chest. Hours passed, then days. I lost track of time. At some point, I realized that I wasn't alone. I wasn't just lost in the woods. Something was watching me, something old, something ancient. It followed me from a distance, never showing itself but always there, just beyond the periphery of my vision. Sometimes I would hear footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate, as though someone were walking in my exact footsteps, mirroring my movements. But whenever I turned around, the path would be empty. The air felt thick with a presence, and it wasn't the woods. It was something more. In a final desperate attempt, I tried to leave, heading for what I thought was the park's exit. But the further I walked, the more I realized that I was going in circles. The same trees, the same shadows, the same oppressive silence. I found no signs of human life, no trails, no markers. The land had swallowed me whole. By the time I was found, days later, weak and delirious, my body was covered in strange markings, almost like scratches, though I couldn't remember how I got them. I was disoriented, muttering about the forest and the things that followed me, but no one believed me. They thought it was just exhaustion, hunger, and exposure. But I knew the truth. The Smokies weren't just a park. They were a place of darkness, of things older than the trees themselves, and I had trespassed into their domain. I've tried to leave it behind, but the memories haunt me still. The whispering, the heavy footsteps, and the feeling that something is always watching, waiting for me to return. I don't know what I stumbled upon in the Great Smoky Mountains, but I regret ever stepping foot in that cursed place. The land doesn't forget, and neither do its inhabitants. I had always prided myself on being a seasoned traveler, a writer who thrived on the stories I could uncover through the lens of my camera and the ink of my pen. My travels had led me to places of cultural significance, to the craggy peaks of the Himalayas, the arid deserts of Morocco, and the quiet lakes of Scandinavia. I had walked the paths of ancient civilizations and explored dense forests that locals claimed were filled with spirits. But none of those places had intrigued me like the Great Smoky Mountains. As a geographer, I understood the natural forces that shaped these vast, sprawling mountains, the weather patterns, the soil, the flora and fauna. But there was something about this park that didn't fit neatly into my maps. This wasn't just a place defined by rivers and peaks. It was a place that had a life of its own, a sense of agency, as though it remembered things that had happened long before humans had ever set foot on its soil. The Smoky Mountains, straddling the border of Tennessee and North Carolina, were one of the oldest mountain ranges in the world. They were a place where time itself seemed to slow down. Thick forests, mist-covered valleys, and the air, thick with moisture and history, wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. The scent of damp earth mixed with the sharpness of pine and spruce. The air was alive with the buzzing of insects and the occasional rustle of creatures moving through the underbrush. It felt ancient, a place untouched by the modern world. But this wasn't just the geography of the park that pulled at me. It was something else, a feeling I couldn't quite place, but one that seemed to permeate the entire landscape. When I arrived, I was greeted by the usual park rangers, tourists milling about, eager to take in the views and snap pictures. But I could sense that beneath the surface, there was a tension. The locals, who I encountered in nearby towns, spoke with a kind of reverence when talking about the Smokies. And there was something unsettling in their eyes, a shadow they couldn't quite shake off. I spoke to a few hikers who had ventured into the park for a weekend trek. One man, a seasoned outdoorsman with a weathered face and stories of many trails, told me, "There's something about the Smokies. It's got a way of changing you. You might go in with one idea, but it'll leave you questioning everything you thought you knew." At the time, I dismissed it. Perhaps it was just the weight of the legends surrounding the park, the folklore, the whispered tales of ghosts and mysterious disappearances. But the more I listened, the more it felt like something was deeply wrong with the place. Even the park rangers had an air of unease about them. One evening, after I had been out for hours, I passed by a ranger station. The ranger there was a woman with sharp eyes and a quick smile. Her name was Janet, and she had been working in the park for over a decade. As we exchanged pleasantries, I couldn't help but notice how quickly her demeanor shifted when I mentioned I was planning on heading into the more remote areas of the park the next day. "Be careful," she said, her voice low. "You might think you're alone, but you're never alone in the Smokies." "Not really." I laughed it off, thinking she was just playing into the park's spooky reputation. But the warning stuck with me. That night, the weather shifted. The air grew thick and heavy, a storm hanging in the distance, ready to break. The clouds hung low in the sky, casting an eerie pall over the landscape. I set up camp near the trailhead, surrounded by trees that seemed to close in on me. There was something about the silence that struck me as odd. It wasn't the quiet of nature. Birds, insects, and the occasional rustle of the wind were absent. The air felt dead. I lit a small fire, hoping for comfort as the temperature began to drop. It wasn't long before I heard it, the whispering. It wasn't the wind that I knew. It was too deliberate, too human. Soft voices, hushed like distant murmurs, but with an unmistakable presence. I couldn't place the language, or even the tone, but I could feel it creeping under my skin. The voices seemed to move around me, following me from one side of the camp to the other, never fully audible, but always there. At first, I told myself it was just the wind, but then I heard footsteps. Heavy, dragging footsteps, moving in the direction of the voices. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. But when I turned, there was no one there. Just the vast, impenetrable trees and the fog rolling in, thick and suffocating. It was as though the park itself had become aware of me, aware of my presence. The shadows between the trees seemed to lengthen, stretching out toward me, as if they were reaching for something. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Later, after I had left the camp and wandered further into the woods, I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. A series of symbols carved into the bark of a tree, strange and foreign. They weren't just random markings, they were deliberate, ancient. I tried to take a photo, but my camera malfunctioned as I snapped the shot, flashing, buzzing, then going black. The forest around me felt wrong, like it was pressing in on me, suffocating me. The deeper I ventured, the more I realized something was terribly off. The trees weren't just trees. They were part of something older, something far beyond anything I had ever understood. They stood as silent witnesses to secrets too dark for humans to uncover. And that was when I truly began to understand. The Smokies weren't just a national park. They were a place of deep, ancient power, and I had wandered too far into its domain. The deeper I ventured into the Great Smoky Mountains, the more I felt something pressing down on me. At first, it was subtle, a sense of being watched, the flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. But as I pushed further into the park, the sensation became more pronounced. The shadows were no longer just the absence of light, they felt alive, as if they had substance and purpose. My heart began to race, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves had me spinning around, half expecting to find someone, or something, lurking behind me. But nothing was ever there. I had come to the Smokies for the solitude, for the tranquility that these ancient woods promised. But the deeper I traveled, the more I realized how naive I had been. I was an intruder in a place far older and more mysterious than I had ever given credit for. This wasn't just a park, it was a domain, an ancient wilderness that held secrets buried deep beneath its soil. And those secrets, they didn't want to be found. I had spent years writing about the natural world, but nothing had prepared me for this. I had walked through forests in Asia and Europe, crossed deserts where the earth felt ancient and alive. But this was different. The trees were so thick here, their trunks gnarled and twisted, like they had seen the rise and fall of empires. The ground was soft, spongy, as if it absorbed the weight of time. And the fog, it was suffocating. It hung thick and low, obscuring the path ahead, pulling at the edges of my vision. It was almost as if the fog had a mind of its own, wrapping itself around me, trying to push me back. And yet, I pressed forward. My curiosity, my need to understand, drove me onward. I wasn't the type to back down easily. As a writer and geographer, I needed answers. What was it that made this place so wrong? I began to hear the whispers more frequently. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but as the days passed, I became certain that it wasn't. The voices were too distinct, too purposeful. They were low and hushed, always just out of reach. Sometimes I thought I heard my name, just a faint call, barely audible, like a breath on the wind. Other times, it was a language I couldn't understand, a hum of consonants that made my skin crawl. It was on the 4th day of my journey that I found the clearing. It wasn't a part of the trail. It was a hidden place, a secret grove tucked away among the dense trees. I had stumbled upon it by accident, but as soon as I stepped into the clearing, a sense of dread washed over me. There was something wrong about this place. The ground was too still, the air too thick. The trees surrounding the clearing stood like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out as though to trap me inside. At the center of the clearing was a large stone altar, weathered and worn by centuries of exposure. It was etched with symbols, strange, cryptic marks that I had never seen before. My eyes traced the patterns, and my mind raced to make sense of them. They were old, ancient even. Some of them looked familiar, like the markings I had seen on the tree back at my camp, but these were far more intricate. They weren't just carvings, they were a language, an unspoken connection to something dark. I could feel it, the weight of history, of forgotten rituals, pressing down on me. I was about to step closer to the altar when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The growl was not animal, it was something deeper, more primal, like the earth itself was angry. It echoed through the trees, vibrating the ground beneath my feet. And then the fog rolled in. It wasn't the same mist that had clung to the trees before. This was different. It moved like a living thing, slithering across the ground, swallowing everything in its path. I took a step back, panic creeping into my chest. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. The world felt too still, too quiet. The fog enveloped me, and I felt my feet give way beneath me. It wasn't the ground shifting, but something else, something unseen, pulling me down. I stumbled, trying to steady myself, but the fog was suffocating. It filled my lungs, burned my eyes, and wrapped around me like a shroud. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. I reached out, my hand flailing for something solid, but there was nothing but air, thick and choking. And then I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the fog, a figure emerged. It was tall, too tall for any human being. Its shape was shrouded in darkness, its outline shifting as though it were made of smoke. It moved toward me with slow, deliberate steps, its presence sending waves of fear crashing over me. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure came closer, and I could feel it now, a malevolent force radiating from it, an energy that seemed to draw me in. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind screaming for escape, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The figure stepped closer still, and in its hollow black eyes, I saw the reflection of my own fear. That was when I understood. This wasn't just a haunting. This was something far worse. The Smokies weren't just hiding ancient secrets, they were alive with them. It had been waiting for me, for someone like me. The park had drawn me in, lured me with the promise of mystery, but now it was revealing its true nature. The Smokies were not a place for visitors, they were a place for sacrifice. As I stumbled back from the figure in the fog, the world around me twisted further, unraveling in ways I couldn't comprehend. My sense of reality seemed to bend, as though the very fabric of time and space was being manipulated. I tried to clear my head, but my thoughts were fragmented, scattered like leaves in the wind. There were too many things happening at once, and the deeper I went, the more I realized that the Smoky Mountains weren't just a place of supernatural occurrences. They were an enigma of contradictions, a place that thrived on paradoxes. The first of these contradictions came in the form of a fellow traveler, a woman named Sarah. I had encountered her a few days earlier at a trailhead. She was an archaeologist, working on a project related to the early settlers of the region, or so she claimed. We had exchanged pleasantries, and despite the fact that her focus seemed to be entirely on the historical aspects of the mountains, there was something off about her. She had a way of looking at the landscape that felt too calculating, too observant. It wasn't the curiosity of an academic, it was the cold calculation of someone who was looking for something more. I'd brushed off the feeling at the time, assuming she was just another researcher with an overly intense fascination for old bones and forgotten relics. But now, in the midst of the fog and the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah knew more about these mountains than she was letting on. The way she spoke about the park, her references to local legends, her knowledge of its hidden corners, everything felt too precise, too rehearsed. I wasn't the only one in the park that day, though. As I wandered deeper into the woods, trying to escape the choking fog, I encountered several hikers and campers. Some looked lost, others simply indifferent to the ominous atmosphere. But there was one man who stood out among them, an old, weathered man with a rough beard and tattered clothes. He was sitting by the side of the trail, his eyes fixed on the ground as if he were in some sort of trance. I approached cautiously, unsure whether to disturb him, but he looked up at me as I neared. "You're not from around here, are you?" His voice was raspy, as though he hadn't spoken in years. "No, I'm just passing through," I answered. His eyes bore into mine with an intensity that unnerved me. "Be careful," he muttered, his gaze darting nervously around the woods. "This place isn't just trees and rocks. It's alive, and it doesn't like strangers." I paused, unsure of how to respond. Was this just a rambling old man lost in his delusions, or did he know something I didn't? The man continued, his voice low and urgent. "You're not the first to come looking for answers, and you won't be the last. But this park, it doesn't forgive those who pry too deeply." His words hung in the air, thick with warning, but before I could ask more, he turned away abruptly, retreating into the forest like a shadow. I stood there, stunned by the encounter, the weight of his words sinking in. Who was he? What did he know? But the deeper I went, the more these strange occurrences multiplied. As I ventured through the fog-laden trails, I began to encounter more and more evidence of others who had come before me. Some who had disappeared entirely, and others who had left behind only cryptic marks, carvings, and traces of their presence. It wasn't just the eerie sense of being watched or the oppressive silence that unsettled me. It was the undeniable fact that the mountains seemed to be collecting them. Their legacies, their stories, their remnants were absorbed into the landscape itself, as though the park was not simply a backdrop, but a participant in something larger, more sinister. Then there was the strange, unnerving reoccurrence of symbols that matched those on the altar I had found earlier. They began to appear everywhere. On the trees, carved into rocks, even scratched into the ground. At first, I thought I was seeing things, but as time went on, I couldn't ignore it any longer. These markings were real, and they were growing in number. It was as though something, or someone was trying to send a message, guiding me or perhaps warning me. But the biggest and most unsettling complexity lay in the shifting nature of the fog itself. It wasn't just a natural phenomenon, it felt deliberate. It moved like an intelligent being, pushing me into certain areas, corralling me toward places I had no intention of going. The fog felt like a predator, and I the prey. Every time I thought I had evaded it, it would return, swallowing me whole, drawing me back into the heart of the woods where the whispers were loudest, and the darkness seemed to close in on all sides. And then Sarah reappeared. I found her one evening as the sun began to set, the fog still thick around us. She was standing in front of the stone altar, the same one I had seen earlier, her fingers tracing the symbols etched into its surface. She didn't seem to notice me approach, so absorbed was she in her task. But when I called out to her, her head snapped up, and for a moment her face was blank, almost too calm. "You found it," she said softly, her voice devoid of emotion. "I knew you would. That's why I've been watching you." "Watching me?" I asked, confusion mixing with a growing sense of dread. "What do you mean? What is this place?" Sarah looked down at the altar, her expression unreadable. "This place, it's not just a part of the world. It's a doorway, a bridge. People come here because they are called, just as you were. And when they do, they're chosen." I stepped back, a shiver running down my spine. Chosen? Chosen for what? But she didn't answer. Instead, she turned away from me, as if I no longer mattered, and stepped into the thickening fog. The last thing I saw was her silhouette fading into the mist, her footsteps silent, as if the very ground was swallowing her whole. The fog closed in on me like a living thing, suffocating my every move. The air felt thick and oppressive, as if it were pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. I tried to shake the feeling of being watched, but the more I tried, the more intense it became. It was as if the Smoky Mountains had decided to claim me, to bind me to its ancient secrets, and I had unwittingly crossed a line that should never have been crossed. I wandered through the fog, trying to retrace my steps, hoping to find something familiar, but the more I walked, the less I recognized the terrain. The trees looked different now, their twisted shapes almost unnatural, their branches reaching out like gnarled hands, grasping for me. The trail had disappeared, swallowed up by the shifting mist. It was as though the park itself had swallowed me whole, trapping me in a labyrinth of its own making. My mind was beginning to unravel. Sarah's cryptic words echoed in my mind, but they were soon drowned out by the growing sense of dread that clawed at my insides. Asterisk chosen. Chosen for what? Asterisk what did she mean by that? And why had she vanished into the fog without another word? I should have followed her. I should have demanded answers. But something deep inside told me that it was too late for that now. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps behind me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the sound grew louder, closer. Someone was following me, someone who moved with purpose, their steps deliberate, as if they knew exactly where I was going. Or perhaps where I was supposed to go. I turned around, but there was no one there. The fog had swallowed everything, and the trail behind me was as empty as the one ahead. I called out, my voice cracking with fear, but the only response was the eerie silence of the mountains. The footsteps continued, though just beyond my reach, like an invisible presence stalking me. Every now and then, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mist, a shadow flitting between the trees, just out of sight. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. The realization hit me like a blow to the gut. I wasn't alone. Not truly. The park wasn't just a place, it was alive. And whatever force inhabited these mountains, it was drawing me deeper into its grasp. I was no longer an observer, a mere traveler passing through. I was a part of something much darker than I had ever anticipated. The ground beneath me shifted, and I stumbled, my foot catching on something unseen in the thick undergrowth. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, my hands pressed against the damp earth. As I tried to steady myself, I noticed something I had overlooked in my panic. A stone, half buried in the dirt, with the same symbols I had seen earlier carved into its surface. It was part of the same pattern I had found on the altar, the same markings that Sarah had been tracing. This stone, though, was different. It wasn't just a symbol carved into the earth, it was glowing. Faintly at first, a dull red light flickering in the center of the symbol. I touched it hesitantly, half expecting it to burn my skin, but when my fingers made contact, the glow intensified, and a deep, resonant hum vibrated through the ground beneath me. Suddenly, the air around me seemed to crackle with energy, and the fog parted, revealing the trees beyond. But they weren't the same trees I had seen earlier. These trees were ancient, their bark twisted and darkened with age, their limbs stretching out like fingers clawing at the sky. In the distance, I saw a figure standing motionless, a silhouette against the eerie backdrop. It was Sarah. She wasn't alone. Around her, there were others, figures standing in a circle, their faces obscured by hoods, their bodies cloaked in shadows. They were like a cult, or perhaps a gathering of those who had come before me, drawn by the same force. I could feel the weight of their gaze, even from a distance. They were watching me, waiting for something. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, held captive by the energy that surged through the ground, binding me to the spot. The humming sound grew louder, vibrating through my bones, and I could hear voices, whispers, coming from all directions. They weren't words, not exactly. It was more like a language I couldn't comprehend, but one I instinctively understood. "You are here now," the voices seemed to say. "You have crossed the threshold. You are one of us." Suddenly, Sarah's voice broke through the chaos, clear and commanding. "You don't understand," she said, her voice like a knife cutting through the fog. "This is what you came for. This is what you were meant to find." I looked at her, a surge of panic rising in my chest. "What are you talking about? What is all of this?" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, her movements fluid, almost unnatural. The others followed her lead, their faces still hidden in shadow, but their presence felt suffocating, oppressive. "The mountains call to us," Sarah said, her voice now low and hypnotic. "It isn't just the land that you need to fear, it's what lies beneath. The forces that have been here long before any of us, long before the settlers, the explorers. You've awoken them. You've stirred the ancient ones." I could feel it then, the ground beneath my feet, the trees around me, everything was alive. The park wasn't just haunted by the dead, it was a place of living, breathing darkness, and I had stumbled into its heart. In that moment, I understood. This wasn't just an adventure or a journey of discovery, it was a trap. The park wasn't a place to explore, it was a place to be consumed. And it had already begun with me. The realization hit me like a freight train. The Smoky Mountains weren't a mere park, a scenic getaway for hikers and nature enthusiasts. It was a place of deep, ancient power, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred, where the very land itself seemed to pulse with an intelligence of its own. As the figures in the fog moved toward me, I felt a coldness seep into my very soul. The energy in the air was thick, almost palpable, and it was as if the land was drawing me closer, pulling me into its web. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble, and the humming sound that had grown louder before now seemed to vibrate within my chest. It was no longer just a noise, it was a force, one that seemed to push against me, threatening to crush me under its weight. I could feel the pressure building, like the air was too heavy to breathe, like it was crushing me from all sides. But it wasn't just the physical sensations that overwhelmed me. It was the sense of betrayal, of having been lured into something far beyond my control. I had come to the Smoky Mountains seeking answers, seeking the truth behind the strange occurrences I'd heard about. But what I had found was far darker than I could have ever imagined. And now there was no way out. Sarah's voice reached me again, this time calm and almost soothing, as though she had known this moment would come. "It's too late now," she said, her eyes locked on mine. "You've crossed the threshold, just like I did. There's no going back." "Back from what?" I croaked, my throat dry. "What are you talking about?" Her expression softened, almost as if she pitied me. "The forces in this place, they don't let go. They've been calling to you, drawing you in. They've been watching you since the moment you set foot here. You were meant to come here, just like I was. We're not just visitors anymore. We're a part of this place." A cold shiver ran down my spine as I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The fog was closing in again, thicker now, like a living presence, obscuring my vision. The figures in the mist were still approaching, and despite their slow pace, I could sense that they were not in any hurry. They had all the time in the world. "I didn't ask for this," I muttered, the words slipping from my lips before I could stop them. "I just wanted to understand. I just wanted to explore." "You were never meant to understand," Sarah said, her voice quieter now, almost melancholic. "None of us are. The land chooses who it claims, and the rest, well, the rest are just lost." I looked around, hoping for some sort of escape, some way to break free from the invisible grip the mountains had on me. But there was no way out. The trees, the fog, the shadows, they all seemed to be closing in, tightening their hold on me. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift again, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I was no longer in control of my own body. My legs refused to move, my arms felt heavy, as if bound by invisible chains. I tried to scream, to shout for help, but the words never left my mouth. The park's eerie quiet had become deafening, a silence that felt oppressive, like the mountains themselves were listening, waiting for something. It was a silence that felt alive, like a predator waiting for its prey to make a wrong move. As I stood there, frozen, the figures in the fog continued their slow approach. They didn't speak, didn't make a sound beyond the rustle of their dark robes in the wind. The hooded figures moved as one, like a well-rehearsed dance, each step deliberate, calculated. Their eyes, hidden beneath their hoods, felt like 1,000 invisible hands reaching into my soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed by a force greater than fear, a kind of paralysis born of the realization that I was not just in danger. I was trapped. I was a part of something ancient and far more powerful than I could comprehend. I turned my gaze back to Sarah, trying to understand what had happened to her, what had happened to us. The woman I had spoken to just hours before, the one with the playful yet mysterious energy, was now a shadow of herself. Her eyes were empty, as if all the life had been drained from them, leaving behind nothing but a hollow shell. She was no longer human in the way I understood. It was as though the mountains had taken her, and in return, she had become one of them. "The fog, it's a prison," I said hoarsely. "Is that why you stayed here? To become part of this place?" Sarah's lips twitched into the smallest of smiles, a smile that was more sorrowful than reassuring. "It's not a choice, not really," she said softly. "Once the mountains claim you, there's no escape. The fog, the trees, the stones, they're all part of it. The spirits, the forces that live here, they don't allow anyone to leave. Not unless you've been chosen." "Chosen?" I repeated, feeling the weight of the word on my chest. "But I never asked for this. I never wanted to be." "None of us do," she whispered. "But once you're here, you're part of it. You're part of the land now." In that moment, I realized the truth. I was never meant to leave the Smoky Mountains. The park had drawn me in, and now it would never let me go. The hooded figures finally reached me, surrounding me in a circle. They didn't speak, didn't offer me any explanation. There was no need. The mountain had already claimed me. The choice had been made. The fog closed in, thick and suffocating, as I stood surrounded by the hooded figures. My mind was racing, frantic thoughts swirling in the darkness as the weight of my situation settled over me like a crushing burden. I had been drawn into something far beyond my understanding, something ancient, something that could not be escaped. Every instinct screamed for me to fight back, to find a way out, but the very air around me felt oppressive, almost suffocating. For a moment, I felt myself slipping, my body trembling as the terror that had taken root in my chest threatened to overwhelm me. But then something shifted. A thought, like a spark, flickered to life in the back of my mind. It wasn't fear anymore. It was clarity. I had come to the great Smoky Mountains seeking answers, seeking the truth behind the strange occurrences. But what I had found was so much darker. And now, standing here, suffocated by the fog, surrounded by the forces of the mountain, I realized something else. I couldn't let this place take me. I had to fight. I had to break free, no matter the cost. The figures, silent and unmoving, seemed to sense the shift within me. They didn't react, didn't show any signs of aggression or even acknowledgement. They simply waited. But I wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. Not after everything I'd experienced. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, my eyes scanning the scene around me. The figures didn't move, but I could feel their presence all around, like a weight pressing down on me. I looked to Sarah, her face a mask of resignation, her eyes empty, as if she had already given up. But in that moment, I understood something about her. She hadn't chosen to stay here. She had been broken by the mountain's grip, trapped in a place where there was no escape. And if I didn't act, I would be the same as her. The fog parted just enough to allow a weak sliver of moonlight to break through, casting an ethereal glow on the landscape around us. I didn't know why, but in that moment, the clarity I had been searching for hit me. The land didn't want me to leave because it had its claws in me. But I wasn't like Sarah. I wasn't going to let the mountains take me. Not without a fight. I knew I couldn't physically overpower the forces at play here, but I could resist. I could refuse to accept the role it wanted me to play. I had come to this place seeking truth, but I had also come seeking purpose, seeking a deeper connection with the world around me. Now I was finding that purpose, even if it meant defying the forces that had drawn me in. "Sarah," I said, my voice shaking at first, but gaining strength with each passing word, "you're wrong. You don't belong here. I won't let it take me." She didn't react at first. She simply stood there, her eyes vacant, her expression one of defeat. But then something flickered behind her gaze, a spark of recognition, a flicker of the person I had met before. "Please," I continued, my voice pleading. "You don't have to stay here. You can fight it, just like I will." Sarah's gaze locked onto mine, and for the first time since I had met her, I saw a glimmer of something human. She blinked, and for a moment, the fog around us seemed to lessen just slightly. "You can't fight it forever," she whispered, her voice heavy with sorrow. "It's stronger than us. The mountain." "No," I interrupted, more forcefully than I intended. "You're wrong. The mountain isn't stronger than me. It can take me, but it won't break me. I'll fight until the end." There was a moment of silence. The fog swirled around us, heavy and dense, but it felt different now. It wasn't an insurmountable force anymore. It was something I could push against, I took another deep breath, focusing all my energy on one simple thought. I had control. I had the power to choose. Without warning, I stepped forward, my legs shaking beneath me, but my resolve solid. The hooded figures didn't stop me. They didn't move, didn't attempt to stop my progress. It was as if they were waiting for me to make a choice. They were not the aggressors. They were simply the manifestation of the mountain's will, an ancient force that bent the world to its will. But not me. I reached out my hand, feeling the cool air of the night on my skin. The fog parted in front of me just a fraction, and I saw the outline of the trees, the path I had walked to get here. I had been drawn to the Smoky Mountains by my curiosity, yes, but now I was leaving them behind. No longer a victim to their grip. I turned back to Sarah, my heart heavy with the knowledge that I might never see her again. She was too far gone, too consumed by the mountain's hold. But I knew what I had to do. I had to leave. For me. I won't be like you, I said, my voice steady despite the tremors still coursing through my body. I won't let it take me. I won't let it break me. For the briefest moment, I saw something flicker in her eyes. It was brief, but I saw it. Hope. It was the last thing she had left, and for a fleeting moment, I felt as though I had given her something to hold on to. The fog seemed to loosen its grip on me, and the figures began to dissipate, their forms vanishing into the mist. The mountain's hold, which had felt so suffocating moments before, seemed to ease just a little. I took one final look at Sarah, then turned away. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to walk. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I had overcome. I had chosen to fight, to break free, and that was more than the mountain had ever bargained for. And as I stepped forward, the fog parting just enough to show me the way, I realized that the true battle wasn't against the land or the forces that haunted it. It was within myself. It was about the choices I made, the strength I found when everything seemed lost. I had fought for my freedom, and that was something the mountains could never take from me. I had thought I could outrun the darkness that clung to the Smoky Mountains, but I had been wrong. The mountain had already taken hold of me in ways I couldn't begin to understand, and the more I tried to escape, the more it seemed to tighten its grip. The fog, the whispering trees, the eerie silence, it was all part of something greater, something I was powerless to avoid. But still, I pressed forward, determined to confront whatever lay at the heart of this place. I had no choice now. The stakes were too high. The path ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, winding through dense forest and thickening mist. The moonlight barely cut through the gloom, casting long shadows that danced along the trail like specters. I could feel my breath coming faster, my chest tightening with every step I took, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Not when I was so close. Saras vorts ihuten my mint, hunting me. You can't fight it forever. She had been right, in a way. The mountain's pull was insidious, wearing down anyone who came here long enough. It tested your resolve, your spirit, until you were nothing more than a hollow shell. Sarah had succumbed, and now, I feared I might be next. But I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let this place claim me the way it had claimed so many others. The memories of the figures, those hooded shapes that had surrounded me earlier, haunted my every thought. Their presence was an enigma, a force so ancient and unknowable that it defied all logic. They were not human. They weren't even alive in the conventional sense. They were something else, something that had existed long before people like me ever set foot on these lands. And yet, they had not stopped me. In fact, they had stepped aside as I pushed forward, as though they were waiting for me to make my choice. It was as if they knew that I wasn't going to go down without a fight. But what kind of fight was I preparing for? What could I possibly do to defeat an ancient force like this? As I walked, I tried to ground myself in the present moment, reminding myself why I had come here in the first place. My passion for writing, my thirst for knowledge, my desire to understand the unexplained, it was all still with me. But now, that desire had become a battle for survival. The curiosity that had led me to these mountains, to the mysteries within, had also bound me to them in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. The trees around me seemed to close in, their branches twisting like dark arms reaching out to grab me. The fog thickened again, blurring my vision, making it harder to see the path ahead. But in that haze, I saw something, a flicker of movement just beyond the trees. A shadow. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a product of the exhaustion and fear that gnawed at my mind. But as I approached, the figure became clearer. A woman, or what had once been a woman. Her form was translucent, ghostly, her face gaunt and pale. She stood motionless, her hair whipping around her face in the wind, as though it were a part of the fog itself. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't just any ghost. It was something else, something far darker. I stepped closer, my feet crunching on the wet earth beneath me. The woman didn't move, but her eyes, the hollow black eyes, turned to meet mine. There was something in those eyes that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't fear or sorrow or even anger. It was emptiness, a deep, consuming emptiness that seemed to swallow everything in its path. The silence between us stretched out, and I could feel the weight of the moment, the weight of the decision I had to make. Should I run? Should I try to escape before it was too late? Or was this a part of the test, a final trial before I could break free? I didn't know the answers, but one thing was clear. I couldn't let fear control me. I had come too far to turn back now. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward, my voice trembling as I spoke into the eerie quiet. "What do you want from me?" I asked, the words heavy with a mixture of dread and defiance. I was fully aware that whatever I was speaking to was not human, but the question still slipped from my mouth. The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, motionless, her hollow eyes staring into mine, as though waiting for something, perhaps for me to make the next move. She was a reflection of everything I had been fighting. The terror, the uncertainty, the unknown. But I wasn't going to be like Sarah. I wasn't going to succumb to whatever dark force was behind this. I had been brought here by my own curiosity, and now it was time to face the consequences of that curiosity. I had been given a choice, and I would make it, no matter the cost. Without another word, I turned and pushed forward, ignoring the strange woman's gaze that followed me from behind. Every part of my being screamed for me to run, to leave this place, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The only way out was through. The fog began to dissipate as I moved further into the woods, and I saw a faint light in the distance, just beyond the trees, flickering like a distant beacon. It was a light I hadn't seen before, and it beckoned to me like a promise. But I knew the truth. It wasn't a beacon of hope. It was a trap, and I was walking straight into it. But at least I was walking. At least I was moving forward. And with each step, I felt something inside me shift, something that had been dormant within me for so long, strength. I wasn't helpless anymore. I wasn't a passive participant in this story. I was the one writing it now. And as I approached the light, I realized the truth. The mountain had been testing me all along. But it had underestimated me. It had underestimated my will to survive, my desire to break free. The end was coming, and it would be my choice how it would unfold. The light ahead grew brighter as I continued my march through the dense, foggy forest, each step a mix of dread and determination. It wasn't the comforting glow of a campfire or the soft radiance of the moon. It was cold, harsh, and unnatural, casting long shadows that seemed to crawl along the ground. The light flickered, like a candle on the verge of going out, and every time it flickered, I felt something inside me, something primal, stir in response. I wasn't sure what was drawing me forward anymore. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't the hope of escaping the mountain's curse. No, I was walking because I had to. There was no going back now. Every breath I took seemed to draw me deeper into whatever nightmare awaited at the end of this path. The trees around me twisted unnaturally, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, their dark silhouettes stretching toward the sky. The ground beneath my feet was uneven and slick with moisture, each step sending a small ripple of unease through my body. As I neared the light, a sharp coldness in the air seemed to cling to my skin, sinking deep into my bones. And then I saw it. There, at the heart of the forest clearing, stood an altar. It was made of rough stone, old and weathered, covered in moss and lichen, but it was unmistakable. The center of the clearing, bathed in the eerie light, seemed to hum with an otherworldly energy. Atop the altar, a dark shape lay, obscured by shadows. I couldn't make out what it was, but I could feel its presence. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath. I hesitated. I had read stories of places like this, where people ventured in and never returned, where things older than time itself lingered, waiting for the unwary to make their fatal mistake. And yet, I couldn't turn away. It was as if the mountain was calling me, urging me to come closer, to see what lay hidden beneath the veil of this twisted place. A soft, wet crunch underfoot snapped me from my trance. I looked down to see something dark and sticky coating the ground, just beside my foot. A patch of blood, but it wasn't fresh. It was old, dried, and caked into the earth. I knelt down, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach as I traced my fingers over the sticky substance. My mind raced, scrambling for any explanation, any rational thought that could save me from the horror that was unfolding. Bat nankame. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding, and turned to face the altar again. The air thickened, as if the entire forest had closed in on me. And then I heard it, a voice. It was soft at first, a whisper in the wind, but it quickly became clearer. A low, guttural sound like a chant. It was coming from all directions, as if the trees themselves were speaking to me, or perhaps speaking about me. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, and yet, somehow, I could understand them. They spoke of sacrifice, of power, of things far older than humanity itself. And in that moment, I realized the mountain didn't want me to leave. It wanted me to join it. Suddenly, the air crackled with energy. I looked up to see the dark sky above me rippling, as though it were a sheet of glass, distorting and bending. And then, with a sound like the tearing of fabric, the sky above split open. Through the rift, I saw them, the hooded figures, the ones who had been following me from the beginning. But they weren't alone. In the darkness beyond the rift, shadows moved, slow, deliberate, monstrous. Shapes twisted and coiled like serpents, their eyes glowing with malevolent light. The beings that had been lurking on the edge of my mind were now fully revealed, and what I saw chilled me to the core. They weren't human. They weren't even of this world. They were ancient, incomprehensible, and utterly, terrifyingly indifferent to human life. The figures moved toward me, their steps soundless, their presence crushing. The ritual had begun, and I was the offering. I wanted to run. My body screamed for escape, every fiber of my being telling me to turn and flee. But I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The mountain had me in its grasp, and now it was too late. I was part of the ritual, the final piece needed to complete whatever twisted ceremony this was. My heart hammered in my chest as I struggled against the invisible force that held me in place. The air grew thick with an unnatural pressure, pushing against my chest, my throat, until I could barely breathe. And then the chanting grew louder, more urgent. The rift in the sky widened, the figures drawing closer, their features becoming clearer with each passing second. In one final desperate act, I tried to scream, to call out for help, but the sound was swallowed by the forest. No one could hear me. There was no one left, only the mountain and whatever it had planned for me. I reached for my journal, my last vestige of normality, the tool that had led me here, and I scribbled one final note. A plea, a warning, a record of what had happened, what was happening. My hand shook as I wrote, the ink blotching on the page, but I had to get it out. I had to leave something behind. And then, as the shadowed figures closed in, I realized the truth. The mountain had never been a place for the living. It had always been a place for the dead, and I was just another lost soul to add to its collection. As the darkness closed in around me, the last vestiges of my will flickered, a dim light struggling against the oppressive force that bound me. The hooded figures were now close enough to touch, their pale, ghostly hands stretching out toward me, their eyes glowing with a terrible, ancient hunger. I knew, with a sickening certainty, that there would be no escape. The mountain had claimed me, just as it had countless others before me. The world around me seemed to warp and twist, the ground beneath my feet giving way to a chilling cold. The figures drew nearer, their breaths shallow and ragged, as if they too were drawn by an unholy force, an inescapable fate. I felt their icy touch on my skin, as though they were merging with me, consuming me whole. And then nothing. I don't know how much time passed after that. The world seemed to stretch, to blur, and I lost all sense of where I was. The pain, the fear, the realization that I was lost, vanished into the depths of the abyss. There was only an overwhelming silence that surrounded me, a quiet so deep it was almost suffocating. I felt detached, as if my body no longer belonged to me. I wasn't alive, but I wasn't truly dead either. In that moment of unbearable stillness, I had no sense of time. The figures around me faded into the shadows of the mountain, and the clearing, once filled with unnatural light, was now nothing but a dark void. It was as though I had become part of the mountain itself, trapped in its never-ending grip, a soul forever bound to its cursed land. I remembered the journal in my hand, the last thing I had clung to, the only thread that still tied me to my old life. My final entry was written hastily, but I knew it would be the last thing I could offer to the world. A warning, a plea, a testament to the horrors of this place. The mountain had taken me, but my story, my warning, would remain. And so here I am now, as if frozen in time, a ghost of my former self, bound to this cursed mountain, drifting among the whispers of the lost. There is no escape, no hope, only the chilling certainty that, like so many others before me, I will remain here forever. A nameless soul, lost within the labyrinth of the great Smoky Mountains. I sometimes wonder if anyone will ever find my journal. Perhaps someone will read it and remember me, remember the warning I left behind. But I know that, even if they do, they will never understand. Not until they too come to this place, hear the whispers, and feel the mountain's grip tighten around their chest. It's over for me. The mountain has claimed its prize. But I hope that my story reaches you in time, that you might stay away. The Great Smoky Mountains are not what they seem. There is something far darker hidden within them, something ancient, something that feeds on the souls of those who wander too close. Do not make the mistake I did. Do not venture into its depths, for once the mountain calls, there is no escape. Years have passed since I vanished into the depths of the Great Smoky Mountains, but my story lingers. The park rangers speak of the strange, unexplained disappearances, and locals whisper of sightings, of a man lost in time, forever wandering the mist-shrouded trails. Some say the mountain calls to those who are meant to be lost, that it chooses its victims. And while the world moves on, my warning lives on in the journal I left behind, a chilling reminder that some places are better left unexplored. The mountain still waits, hungry, patient, for the next soul to claim. If you've made it this far, you've already felt the eerie pull of the Great Smoky Mountains. But do not let curiosity be your downfall. Share this warning with others. If you've been to the park or plan to go, stay alert. Something watches from the shadows. Please take this story as a lesson, not a thrill. The mountain doesn't let go easily. If you found this unsettling, imagine the dangers lurking there in silence. Don't forget to like, comment, and share. And if you're brave enough, click on the next video to hear more stories of the unexplained.